Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was March 17th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt Cara Compagnona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Alright, so today I have to fudge the rules a little bit because, yes, there is a document that is very clearly March 17th at the bottom of folio 26V of Register 1751, which is one of Joan's registers, the register of the Sigilli Secrete, the secret seal. And, oh gosh, there's a letter in the middle that, now that I'm looking at it, it's just clearly the 16th, and that's yesterday. So I'm going to talk about both because the middle one is just so much more interesting. Yeah. So we're going to really focus on the middle document today, but I will just point out some things about the one from actually the 17th. So actually, let's do that first. And something that I like about this particular folio is that they ran out of room at the bottom for the probata, and so they took a little scrap of paper and pasted it onto the page. So if you are able to look at the digitized image of this page in Register 1751, what you'll see is that at the bottom right corner, you can clearly see the line of the scrap of paper that they pasted in, and on the left side. The right side, it's a little bit more difficult to see, but on the left side of that scrap of paper for the probata where they pasted it in, you can see that line, and then the probata extends further down below the edge of the folio itself. Now, what's additionally interesting from a material standpoint here is that you can easily see that they pasted the paper, the little additional scrap of paper, before finishing the letter. The date, the year, the Roman numerals for the year, 1387, the way that the scribes almost always wrote the last I in Roman numerals had a long descender below the line. And you can see how that was clearly written after the scrap of paper had been pasted onto the page. It's like a really smooth line there. And you can also see a faint, if you zoom in, you can see a faint gap where the ink has not gone onto the very edge of that scrap of paper. So there's like a faint line that you can then trace over to the bottom of the P that had the descender of the P, and then also the part of the S in Secretarius that descends far below the line. So it's really cool to see how the Chancery handled the situation when they realized, ooh boy, we're not going to have enough room. And they almost had enough room, because if you look at the bottom of the pasted piece of paper, you can see that the only part that like really ran off the length of the page was the fancy probata symbol at the very bottom. But the last line reads mihi per de Beniores, the name of the scribe. And the descender of the P just goes a little bit beyond what would have been the edge of the page. And then pretty much everything else could have fit, except that probata symbol. But you can't really have the official authorization of the document without that probata symbol. Now, an additional interesting thing is that the very bottom of the probata is absent. And in this case, it looks to me like somehow it got cut off. Like there was more to this scrap of paper that had been pasted in, and at some point it got ripped off or cut off with a scissors, because there's no reason why the probata symbol would have been drawn in this way originally. It's just clearly there was more to it. If you're looking at it, there's no way to justify the idea that this is all they put and that's all they had at the bottom. I really don't think so. I think there was more, and that somehow it got cut off. But maybe you could make an argument. No, it's a little bit too much of minutiae to get into more detail about there. I did want to say, though, that something is a little strange when we compare that probata at the bottom to the probata symbol that appears underneath the second document on this page, the one in the middle, because there's a P, but there's no like swirly through the P, and that's very unusual. So I'm not quite sure why they left it off in this situation. The person who was the scribe for the middle document on this folio is the scribe that we've been seeing a lot of for Joan, Père de Benioure. And so I'm not quite sure if there was some additional meaning attached to the fact that we have the letter P but no typical swirl, because we have at the top the very flourishing probata P for the end of that document, which, by the way, is the document that I think Joan and Violante worked on together, because we have the Violante scribe Bartolomeo Sirvent as the one at the bottom of that probata, and then we have let's see, what can we see in there? I don't think we have anything to indicate. Well, we've got the plural dominus. Well, is it? I think that's saying that both the king and the queen together have written that document. So I might need to go back and look at that one more closely in the future. So yeah, we're talking about 3 different documents today. And by the way, that one's from March 14th, the one that ends at the top of folio 26V. All right, so let's talk about the sourcing information for the document from March 17th, which is at the bottom of folio 26V. It's the one that had the scrap of paper added to it. So this document is addressed to Don Pedro Bohil. And at the bottom of the letter, we've got the addressee line, Pedro Bohil Mayordomo Domini Regis. The Mayordomo, Major Domo, is a high-up official, and I'm not all that clear on what makes the mayor. I mean, it's basically like the head of the house is what it equates to in its literal translation. But the actual duties of the mayordomo and the actual status in relation to other things like the chancellor or the whatever, not quite sure about the dividing lines. But it seems like Pedro Bohil is Joan's representative to the King of Castile, because the letter itself is about saying thanks for the information that you've sent to me about affairs, the business of things in the foreign lands, and say hi to me to my Moltcar frere lo rey, and also the prince is his nephews. So I think this is, well, it could be in Navarre, actually, because Joan also refers to the King of Navarre as Moltcar frere lo rey. So maybe this is actually going to Navarre, which might make more sense. Ooh, because he calls the children his nephews, the Nebots. But actually in Castile, it was his sister who was the queen. So actually, no, I think this is Castile. Oh, wish they would just say it. But okay, so then everything else is just kind of general. Things are going well, pleasantries. So there's not much to this letter, and that's why I wanted to spend time fudging the rules of the podcast and talking about the middle document on folio 26V, because I think that one is super interesting, because we've got a specific place name and a specific person who we've talked about before. So way back on, let's see the date, February 23rd. On February 23rd on the podcast, we talked about Isabella de Mallorca. And Joan wrote a safe passage letter for her so that she could travel through the Crown of Aragon and not have to pay up to all her creditors, because she had a ton of debt at this time. And she wanted to come hang out in the Crown of Aragon for don't know why. And she didn't want to have to, pay her creditors who were coming after her to pay up on the debts that she owed. And so Joan wrote her a letter that she could present at all of the different border crossings, saying that it would not be allowed for anybody who claimed to be a creditor of hers to take any of her things. And then on that February 23rd document, there was a little notation that extended the time period of her protection from the duration of the month of March and into the month of April. So originally the document protected her for March, and then there was that notation that said we're going to extend this into April and maybe May. Oh gosh, I'm kind of starting to doubt my memory about that, exactly how long the extension was for. So Isabella de Mallorca was going to arrive at the border between France and the Crown of Aragon pretty soon. And we know this because this letter that Joan wrote on, it looks like the 16th of March, is addressed to the governor of Roussillon. And it says, hey, when the Princess of Mallorca, Infanta de Mallorca is in the first line, when Isabella de Mallorca arrives to the border crossing at Salses, there's a fort there, write to me, let me know, and I will then be able to get affairs in order to receive her in Barcelona. And I think this is super interesting for several reasons. First of all, the fort at Salses is still standing. Now, the Wikipedia page says that it was constructed in the 15th century, so I think that the actual structure is a lot that's there today was not the exact same structure that was there in the time that Isabella de Mallorca arrived in 1387. But, it's Wikipedia, so the exact dating might be a little bit off. Or it could just be that there was a significant expansion of the fort in the 15th century. And if you go there today, maybe you'll be able to see where the earlier 14th century structure was, or maybe just the center part of it is from the 14th century and then the larger surrounding additional parts of it are from the 15th century. That's pretty common. By the way, it reminds me of something, which is that if you go to the Louvre, there in the basement of the Louvre, you can see the castle that was there in the 14th century, the castle where Violante definitely spent time as the resident of the royal court of Charles V. So Violante was there in that castle, and there's parts of the castle walls that still exist underneath the building that is the later, 18th century, I think, structure that was built for the Louvre Palace. So that is really super interesting. So I say that in order to emphasize that for a lot of these locations in Spain and France that we're talking about, you can see pieces of what was there in the 14th century, and then later structures were built up around it and sometimes incorporated it in later centuries. So there's all over the place in these areas that were valuable as capitals or regional centers. They basically built up around older structures a lot of the time. And we've talked about that with like mills, like old mills that date from the 15th century but probably have one wall remaining in the structure from the 14th century, something like that, or even earlier. Okay, so I will put a link to the Wikipedia page for the Salses Fort. It's located just a little bit north of Perpignan. And so this was like the border checkpoint between France and the Crown of Aragon at this time. And so this document reveals a whole lot about travel practices for the elite. So Isabella de Mallorca would have been met by representatives from the officials, the state officials of the Crown of Aragon, and might have been escorted to Barcelona. I would be overjoyed if later on in, say, March or April, I was able to see some other document that helps us to track the movement of Isabella de Mallorca. I also wonder if this says something about the level of trust that Joan had of Isabella de Mallorca. Like, is this person potentially a source of trouble for him and just he wants to be informed of her movement? And that's why this letter exists and the instruction is being sent out to the governor, whose name I'm pretty sure is Pedro Sa Guerriga. So these are just some of the questions that come up as we are looking at this particular snapshot of the relationship between Joan and Isabella de Mallorca, which has a complicated history because his father, Joan's father, was in no way, would never do something this kind, I think, for Isabella de Mallorca because of the past conflict between her brother and the Crown of Aragon, which I went into detail about in the February 23rd episode. So if you're curious about that, go back and listen to that one. And thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, maybe even a picture of the Salses Fort. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.